Good morning. Good morning. How are we doing today? I'm trying to see if I can see the messages from my Restream page, and I'm sure I can. I was so sad to hear about Dolly Parton passing because literally a few days ago I had some photos and videos pop up on my phone from Gatlinburg, which is very close to her hometown. And everything was infused with Dolly. Everybody loved her. And it was so beautiful. Oh, here you go. I was able to connect to LinkedIn too. So everything was infused with Dolly. And she wasn't just a good singer and a humor. She had this, infectious humor, but she also was very kind and very helpful. And everybody absolutely loved her. So that's kind of sad to hear. Um, but I guess it's one of those reminders where we have to remind ourselves that we are still um, here on earth on a limited time, and we don't know what that is. We don't know how that looks like. And looking back, can you see it's already the end of the summer here? And that's also a little crazy, but it just gives us an opportunity to kind of um, look back on what we've done, and if we haven't done everything that we wanted to do, a good moment to reset and be like, yes, I've learned from this, I know what works, where should I prioritize more, and how should I move forward. But today we're talking about courage, and this month I have been exploring courage from many different angles. um, the courage to have a difficult conversation, the courage to say, I do not know, or to make a decision without being completely certain, or even to have the courage to disappoint someone, to change your mind, to let go of something that no longer fits. And as I was putting these pieces together, I realized that they have something important in common, which is the courage is really a level of change. We often think that change begins with awareness, and awareness is really incredibly important because we notice the pattern, we understand why we react the way we do, we recognize the boundaries we need, the conversation we have been avoiding, or the decision we have been postponing. But the uncomfortable part is that you can be uncomfortable, or you can be incredible self-aware and still continue repeating the same pattern. Why is that? Because the knowing doesn't really change anything, right? And there's a space between realizing something needs to change and actually living life differently. And that space actually requires courage. And it's really not a dramatic change. It's the courage that you will choose different response, every single one, when a familiar response will have been much easier. So today I kind of want to talk through four shifts I've been thinking about as in this idea of courageous self-leadership. The first one is the courage to act, the courage to stay present, the courage to choose, and ultimately the courage to trust yourself. And as we move through them, I want you to think about your own life and your own leadership, if you're willing. And instead of asking, where do you need more courage? I want you to notice where you already know something needs to change, but you have not acted on it yet. Because that's where exactly the courage is asking something of you. And I realized I should probably tell you a little bit about who I am before we talk about courageous self leadership. My name is Monica Cristalli. My professional life has really developed across two worlds. I've spent many years in business and operational leadership, leading teams, managing complex portfolios, making decisions where there wasn't always like a clear and perfect answer. But alongside of that, my work has increasingly focused on the inner side of leadership: self-awareness, emotional agility, self-trust. How do we lead ourselves when pressure is high? I've also recently founded the Conscious Women's Circle, a community for women who want to lead and grow with more calm and clarity and confidence and more intentional right? And that at that intersection between how we lead externally and who we are internally is really where today's conversation comes from. Before we get into the four phases, I actually want to spend a moment on this idea that the courage is really the level where change begins. I don't know if you're familiar with some of the concepts from the spiritual research of Dr. David Hawkins, the map of consciousness, where he talks about the courage being really a very defining moment, very defining level, where underneath you have all the emotions that are of a lower calibration, lower feeling. They're kind of heavy. We have anger, we have fear, we have grief, apathy. We have all those emotions that are kind of pulling us into what is familiar. And then we have above courage, where we move into what we will call higher level emotions, emotions that make us feel that we are alive and not everybody's out there to get us. Emotions like I'm neutral, or I am willing to, I'm here to understand, I'm here to help. Forgiveness, love, right? All these emotions and emotional fields that have very positive charges to them. So when change actually doesn't begin when we become aware of something, because awareness gives us information. And I can recognize that I'm overthinking, right? I can see that I'm avoiding a conversation. I can now even know that a boundary needs to change. And I can realize what no longer aligns with me. And still, I can do what I have always done. Right? That is the familiar path. And I think that's very important to kind of look at, because awareness shows us the pattern, but it also creates a choice, right? Once I see the pattern, I have a choice, right? Repeat what is familiar to me, or actually respond differently. And responding differently really feels very uncomfortable, because the old pattern isn't necessarily there because we're weak or because we're incapable. And at some point, most likely, it served us, right? Avoiding conflict may have actually kept the peace, or the apparent peace, right? Over preparing may have helped us succeed. People pleasing may have helped us feeling that we belong. Control helped us feel safe, right? So when we try to change these patterns, we're not simply learning a new behavior. We're asking ourselves to release something completely familiar before the new way feels completely natural to us, right? And that's where courage enters, because I see courage as a bridge between knowing and actually living what we know, right? And this space, something very interesting is happening. The first time when we respond, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen this, it requires an enormous courage, right? The second time, it might be a little bit less. We repeat it, right? And then we go on again and again, and we gather evidence that this worked. Oh my gosh, this worked for us, right? And eventually, what once felt courageous starts to become our new normal. So when I talk about courageous today, I'm not really talking about being fearless, right? I'm talking about that moment of change. So if courage is actually the bridge between awareness and change, what does actually look like? Right. So as I looked through different ways, courage shows us in leadership, and also in my own life, to be honest, I started to seeing really like four shifts. The first one is moving from certainty to action. Can I move? Can I make a decision without knowing every answer? Right. And this is not about being impulsive, but without demanding guarantees before I'm actually willing to take the next step. The second one is actually moving from avoidance to presence. Can I stay present when things become uncomfortable? When everything in me is telling me to run away? Right? That will be like a difficult conversation, or having an uncertain answer, or maybe dealing with a different opinion, right? Can I stay curious instead of immediately avoiding or defending or controlling? The third step is moving from validation to alignment. And this is actually where courage becomes a little bit more personal. Can I make the decision that feels aligned with me, even if someone else is disappointed? even if I need to change my mind along the way, even if I have to release something I've invested in, or even if nobody applauds my decision. Right? And finally, from fear to self trust. And this is a big step here because you're not all of a sudden becoming certain, right? But you're developing enough self trust in yourself to know whatever comes next, I can meet it. Right. So these are the four shifts that we're going to talk about, and they're all built on each other because awareness or action gives us the experience. Presence gives us awareness in the moment, right? Alignment teaches us to choose from our value system, and trust. And those choices actually build our self trust. So as we move through this, four phases, don't think of them as a checklist. Think of them more like a maybe like a map, like an awareness map, because you can recognize strongly yourself in one of these phases today, and that is enough, right? Courageous self-leadership is not about changing everything at once. It's about recognizing where am I now, and what is the next courageous shift before or that I can do that is sort of being asked of me, right? So let's start to look at the first one. If we move from certainty to action, most of us have been taught that good decisions actually come from having enough information. So when we do not feel certain, we actually look for even more information, more research, more opinions, more scenarios. And that is actually a very responsible form of leadership until more information stops improving the decision, right? And I actually had to become of this to become aware of this myself, because there is a point where thinking is productive and we need that analytical mind to kind of step in. And there is a point where thinking actually transforms itself, let's say, into protection. It's like a protection mechanism. And we're no longer gathering information because we need it, but we're gathering information because we're hoping it will remove the risk of choosing. And in life and in leadership, we rarely have that luxury, right? People change, priority change, market shifts. Technology actually is changing faster than many of us can respond to, right? So waiting for certainty can really become a decision of not to move, right? So that's why I don't think like courageous actions really means being fearless or impulsive. It means learning to recognize when you know enough. And I personally come back to a few things. What do I know? What still matters? And do I know enough to take the next step, right? So that really become where courage becomes practical. And you don't need courage because you know what will happen next. You need courage precisely because you do not know what's going to happen next. So the goal is not to eliminate uncertainty before taking action. It's to develop the capacity to move through while some uncertainty remains. And there's always going to be uncertainty. So that is the first shift. Not certainty before action, but enough clarity to actually take the first step. So I want to pause here a little bit and bring some research into this, because our desires for certainty is not necessarily a leadership flaw. As human beings, we actually prefer and we like predictability. And when we know what to expect, there's less ambiguity to process. And when we don't, we actually start looking for ways to create the sense of safety, to create that sense of certainty, right? We go into more information and getting maybe more opinions and imagine all these scenarios. But 82% of the US adults say the world is changing in ways that are difficult to process. And that is significant, right? Because we're trying to make decisions in an environment that often feels increasingly unpredictable. And this, we are living this right now with all the AI changes, and we have lived through the pandemic as well, which is a very still stands as a very good example of the world being unpredictable. The American Psychological Association also points out to something important. When we are dealing with uncertainty, focusing on what we can control and taking appropriate action can help us build confidence in our ability to navigate what comes next. And research on stress, for example, and decision making shows another side of this, which is stress can make us more likely to postpone decisions or stay with the status quo. So there's a very interesting tension here. The more uncertain the environment becomes, the more we want to wait. I don't know if you have seen yourself in that position. I don't know what's happening. Let's just wait. And what's going to happen if you wait? The uncertainty is still going to be there, right? What environment is actually requiring of us, it's to adapt faster. So the question shifts from how do I become certain, or when will I know for sure, to do I know enough to move like right now, to make the next step. So we often assume confidence comes first, and we have learned that action kind of follows, but it's the other way around, right? We act, we experience, we adjust, and confidence grows from the evidence that we can handle what comes next. And then we have evidence that we can handle something we haven't known about, or we haven't done, or we haven't predicted beforehand. So courage isn't necessarily what happens after the confidence arrives. Courage may be one of the ways confidence gets built. And when I think about that in my own life, I have a very clear example. And it was a time when I made a decision without having any idea how this will affect my life, or how it will actually allow me to grow. And that was actually moving to United States. I moved from Romania, and I stepped literally naive into a new world, a different country, different culture, different language, which I know nothing about. And certainty was not there. I didn't have a roadmap, right? And I didn't know how my next year was going to look like. So all of a sudden, what felt comfortable was no longer there, and there were so many things that I couldn't possibly know. How would I adapt? How would I become? If there's going to be a career, how would that look like? Whether I will feel that I belong. And looking back, I actually realized that I didn't become confident and then make the move. I made a move, and confidence was built through everything that I have done, everything that came afterwards, because I learned and I adapted. I learned some more. I worked. I made mistakes, but I kept on doing that, right? And every experience gave me another piece of evidence that I can figure things out, right? And everybody can. So there's a very different from saying, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, right? How I looked at everything was actually more valuable to me. That all of a sudden, I am building trust in my own ability to respond to what's happening. And I think that's also an important distinction in leadership too, because we oftentimes wait for that feeling, or I'm ready, I can do this. But some level of readiness can only be developed through participation, through doing. You cannot think your way into every capability. Some things actually have to be lived, right? So when I'm actually faced with uncertainty today, I can look back at experiences such as that and remind myself that I don't need to know the entire path. I need to know enough to have enough clarity to make the next step, and enough trust in myself to respond to what I learn along the way. And if you were to think about something you can handle easily today that once felt completely unfamiliar, right? You learned through actually moving into that. Okay, if everyone's aligned, if they want to, if you have any questions, or if you want to jump in, you're more than welcome to add a comment. I will be happy to talk to you. All right, the second shift is from moving from avoidance to presence. Taking action is a form of courage. We know this. Well, what happens when the action actually creates discomfort, right? You have the conversation and someone disagrees. You don't know the answers, or something, a decision gets challenged, or a team members bring something up you were not expecting, right? And that is a different kind of courage that is required here. And that is the courage to stay. Because when discomfort actually creates an urge to do something with it, right? We are trying to run away, avoid it, we defend, we over explain. We might even try to fix the situation very quickly. And I was actually very good at avoiding, but I got better. I learned. So what we do is we step in and we take control, right? Because that feels safer and it feels easier than being uncertain what's going to happen next, right? And I've learned that courage in moments like this isn't necessarily about staying or saying more. Sometimes it's about being able to stay present long enough to understand what's happening, right? Can I stay curious when I hear something I don't like? Right? Can I stay curious when I do not have all the answers, or when someone disagrees with me? And that's where present becomes really a leadership practice, because people are constantly learning what happens when they bring up something uncomfortable. If disagreement is met with defensiveness, they learn something, right? And they learn something if a mistake is immediately met with blame, or if they bring up a problem and it's being taken away and solved for them, right? All of your behaviors as a leader is being learned by your team, by someone who's working with you. And eventually, those experiences shape what people are willing to bring into the room. So, courageous leadership isn't about whether we invite honestly, but what do we do when honestly arrives our way, right? And for me, that shift is from avoidance to presence. We're not removing discomfort, we're not controlling the responses, but we're developing enough steadiness to stay curious while discomfort is present. So, notice, what do you do when discomfort shows up? Do you stay present, or do you immediately try to make it go away? Because sometimes the most courageous leadership move is not having all the answers, right? It's actually remaining present, staying present long enough to hear an answer that you haven't yet thought about and you haven't expected yet. Um, this is where the research or psychological safety becomes very relevant. And I think I have talked a little bit about um, the Harvard professor Amy Edmondson, and she describes psychological safety as an environment where people actually believe they can speak up with ideas, questions, concerns, or even mistakes without being punished or without being humiliated for doing so. So, psychological safety doesn't really mean everyone agrees. It actually it actually means disagreements are more possible. People can challenge an idea and ask that uncomfortable question and admit they actually made a mistake, or say that I do not know. And that's incredibly important for leaders, because silence can easily be misinterpreted. What is left lingering in a room, right? Does it everybody agree? When you ask like this, nobody says anything, right? And we tend to assume that everybody is in alignment, right? But there's research from Gallup's workplace researchers that are giving us something that is worth paying attention to, and that is only about 1 in 4 US employees strongly agree that their opinions count at work. So we have about 3 out of 4 people who are not sharing their ideas, which might be very beneficial for you because they don't feel safe to do so, right? So, and they also found that when organizations increase the number of people who strongly feel their opinion counts, um, you see meaningful improvements into the retention and the safety and even the productivity, which we obviously like to tap into more. So this is not simply about making people feel more comfortable, right? And there's actually a business consequence to whether people speak, but there's a part of it that a lot of people don't think about, right? You cannot really create psychological safety by saying, oh, here, my door is always open, come and share with me, right? Because people actually watch and learn what happens after you walk through that door, right? And you don't decide whether it's safe to speak based on what you hear, what people say, but you decide based on what happens when they actually speak, right? And that's where people decide whether it's actually safe to speak again in the next meeting. So one of the simplest question I've started using is, what might we be missing? Right? Instead of asking people to confirm my thinking, I'm asking them to kind of expand it. And then, my part as the leader is to have the willingness to hear the answer, right? And this research actually become a little bit more meaningful to me when I recognize the same pattern in myself, and when I noticed that I believe my contribution matter. I was willing to challenge the question and participate. But when I don't feel heard, actually something very different happens, right? Um, I tend to agree more when I feel my contribution doesn't matter. I would say, yes, yes, we got to do whatever you say. But it's not because I suddenly agree, right, with everything that's being said, and not because I don't have an opinion. And it's simply because I'm less invested in putting my energy and sharing it if it doesn't matter anyway, right? Um, so if I contributed before and I felt dismissed, if the decision seems to have been already made, or if experience tells me that my perspective really is not being considered, I become quiet, right? And I know a lot of people are experiencing this shift. And from the outside, it looks like agreement. Oh, this was a very good meeting. Everybody was like, yes, yes. But it's not always agreement. Sometimes actually is disengagement, right? And recognizing that in myself actually changed the way I think about leadership too. Because if I can do this, everyone can, right? And a quiet room doesn't mean that everybody's aligned. It might actually mean that I don't think saying enough will make a difference here. So that's a very different leadership problem. But it also made me pay much closer attention to what happens after someone contributes, right? And I started to pay attention whether I was truly making space from someone's perspective, or I was simply waiting for my turn to talk, simply waiting for me to explain my thinking, right? So instead, I started to kind of move into a more intentional question, what we might be missing, right? And asking the question is not enough, but I want to demonstrate that I genuinely care and I want to hear the answer. And sometimes that could be like, tell me more. What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? And that sometimes means allowing people's perspective to actually change my thinking, right? And change my decision. So people need to know that their contribution was considered before we expect them to keep contributing. And that's something my own experience had taught me, that silence is not always agreement. Sometimes silence actually happens when someone decides that speaking is no longer worth the effort. And I think as leaders, we need to stay curious enough to know the difference. Um, is this something you have noticed within your team? Who used to contribute more and now is staying quiet? That there might be some message there for you. Okay, the third shift is from validation to alignment. And I think this is where courage becomes really deeply personal, because eventually choosing differently affects other people's expectation. Some might agree with you, but someone might disagree with you. Some might be okay with your decision. Some people might be disappointed. Um, Someone may even question your decisions. And sometimes, and this is fun, the person questioning the decision is actually you. And we talked a lot about having the courage to make a decision. But there is another kind of courage, the courage to stay connected to yourself while you're making a decision, right? And I've learned personally that it's very easy to make decision based on external signals. Will they approve? Will they understand? What would they think? I would assume a lot here, right? Will this make me look inconsistent with who I really am usually? And it's really not wrong to ask yourself this question, because in leadership is very, very important, and it kind of requires us to consider other people's opinion, but consider the consideration and validation are not the same, right? It's not the same thing. The problem begins when other people's reactions becomes the primary measure of whether our decision is right. And that's when we kind of start to adjust ourselves. We say yes when we mean no. We stay when something doesn't really feel aligned with us anymore, right? Because we have invested so much into it. We defend an old decision because changing it might make us look inconsistent. We over prepare, we over explain because we want to prove that we belong and we know what we're talking about. So, underneath all of this, what lays? It lays, what will this say about me, right? But when you move into alignment, the question changes. Knowing what I know now, what is the right choice? And it doesn't mean ignoring everyone or ignoring feedback. It means listening without abandoning my own discernment. Maybe new information genuinely changes the decision. And if that's the case, then change the decision. Maybe you've caused harm unknowingly. Take responsibility for that. And maybe someone simply wanted a different outcome. Allow them to have that response, right? So I ask myself, what do I know now? And what aligns with that? And when you think about courageous self leadership, it's not about being stubborn at all, right? It's not about, oh, I don't care about what everyone else thinks. It's really the ability to remain open to other perspectives without automatically outsourcing your decision to them. It is still your decision. And that is actually that movement from validation to alignment. I can listen, I can reconsider, and I can still choose myself. And if you were to think about a decision that you're carrying right now, could you allow yourself to ask yourself, if I remove everyone else's reaction from the equation, what will I choose? What is it? I already know my decision. What would I choose if nobody's watching and nobody has an opinion, right? And sometimes, the response are actually not hidden. It's right there for you. And there's a psychological reason for this shift from validation to alignment and why this can be difficult. And actually, I was laughing because a lot of people who commented on my post for the last month, they brought up the song Cost Effect. And I was kind of actually building on that. And I was like, yes, some people see it too. So once we've invested something, money, energy, we become more likely to continue on that path, because walking away can really make us feel that we've lost. It makes us feel that that investment is wasted, right? And it doesn't happen only in financial decision where we actually have a monetary component to it, but it happens what in careers. We have seen, and actually I have talked with a lot of women recently who have made they have made pivot, they have changed their careers at 45, 50. They just like decided to have that courage, to not feel that they wasted their time, they wasted their energy, then or sort of their investment into their life, but they took up what they learned and they said, this experience, it has been valuable to me, but now I want to live who I am, right? And it happens in relationship or goals that you have. And it's every version of ourselves. Because if you think about it, I have come so far and I've invested too much to actually stop now. What will people think? What will people think? But the problem is that if we have already invested and it's in the past, we cannot really recover it. We cannot recover our time. We cannot recover our energy. So our past involvement shouldn't, or investment shouldn't automatically determine the next decision. So that's why one question has become very useful for me. If I'm choosing today, not knowing what I know now, would I choose the same thing? Would I choose this life for me? And it's just something kind of that gives you that introspective work. And but what also happens here, that it brings you back to the present, right? Because alignment is a present tense decision. It's happening in the moment, like right now. So the question is whether what I choose still fits me and who I am, or who I know I'm becoming and who I am today, right? And there's another interesting dimension when we look at this through the workspace. Gallup's research consistently show that many people don't feel they're regularly using their strengths or even being encouraged to develop that work. So that kind of, it's, if you think about it, it's kind of like dimming your light, right? So that raises a bigger question for me. How many people are succeeding at something they no longer consciously choose? Right? You might be competent, they might be recognized, they may even be successful by every external measure, but competence and alignment are not the same thing. Sometimes we're very good at something, but we kind of outgrown it. And that is where courage becomes necessary again, right? Because choosing differently may also mean disappointing expectation, or changing a decision, having this ability to let go of an investment, or admit it, this worked for who I was, but it no longer fits who I am becoming. That is not failure. It's actually the awareness, becoming a new choice, right? And this particular shift is actually very personal to me too, because for a very long time I thought about the achievements that I can do, right? I know that I can adapt, I know that I can work very hard, I keep moving, I don't want to fall behind, and all this have really served me on my becoming path. And even completing my studies here, and there's really nothing wrong with achievement, and I value growth deeply. But at some point, I started to notice there's a difference between growth, because it genuinely matters to me, and achieving, right? Because it kind of follows the path I have been doing so far, and I want to prove myself. And sometimes from the outside, actually, they look like exactly the same. You work hard, you prepare, you accomplish the goals, you move on to the next level. But internally, they feel very different. One of them is actually expansion. This idea of growth becomes expansion. Can I look at things differently, not only from this section, but how about from this whole aisle, like the whole store, the whole neighborhood, the whole world? Can I see this differently, right? The other choices where you're proving comes from validation, right? So I started, am I doing this because I want to prove something? And sometimes that's really not comfortable. But if someone else demands that out of you, it actually says that you're working to prove yourself, and your worth shouldn't be tied to your achievements, right? I was carrying so much expectations off of me, and I have become so good at achieving. Um, but being capable of doing more doesn't necessarily mean it's what you need, what you actually feel inside that you need, right? And this is awareness that actually kind of changes the question you're asking, right? Instead of what can I accomplish? What else can I accomplish? um, to ask what actually aligns with the women, with the leader I am becoming. And this question actually influenced how I think about leadership even more, and about my work and my personal growth, and even what success means to me. Alignment doesn't actually, pulls us away from growing. It doesn't ask, oh, take a break here, right? But it makes us conscious about why are you doing what you're doing. And that made me look at things differently. And what am I pursuing, right? What am I committed to? And what am I still saying yes to, even if I don't really feel like it, right? What if, is this still aligned with me? What if it's not? Am I protecting an identity that was built around achievement. And that achievement gave me the worth that I was craving, right? And that's where this idea of courageous self leadership becomes really personal, because it's really not about doing more, but having the courage to no longer need achievement to prove who you are, to prove your worth. So I would like to invite you to think about your own definition of success. Where in your life has achievement become automatic rather than intentional, right? And there may be nothing to change here per se, but becoming aware of this difference give you something that I personally value so much, and that is the freedom to choose. The freedom to choose. And that brings us to the last and the fourth shift, which is moving from fear to self trust. And I think sometimes we misunderstand self trust. We imagine it sounds like, I know I'm making the right decision. I know this will work. I know exactly what I'm doing. But there's that certainty again, right? Can you be 100% sure that this is the perfect decision? Not really, right? But we have established, I think a little bit earlier, we said that certainty isn't always available. The world is really 100, it's not 100% certain, because there's so many things that can change and shift left and right with every single decision you're making and the world is making around you, right? So for me, self-trust has really became something different. I don't need to know what's happening next, but I want to be able to trust myself with what's happening next, right? And that's a different kind of confidence, because you might still have doubt a little bit here and there, and you might still have people who will disagree, and they will disagree with me for certain. It is what it is. But the outcome can still be uncertain, cannot be 100% sure, but none of these things automatically get to make the decision, right? I hold the power on that. And this is where all these three phases that we talked about so far kind of like come together, right? Because every time I act without completing certain what's happening, I gather evidence. Every time I stay present in an uncomfortable moment, I gather evidence, right? Every time I make an aligned decision without needing anyone to validate it or everyone to validate it, I gather evidence. And the evidence begins to say, I can rely on myself. I can rely on myself, not to be perfect, right? Not to get things right all the time, but to notice and to actually respond. And if needed, to adjust and to take responsibility and then choose again. And that's why I don't think self leadership is something that we simply decide to have, right? We build it through our relationship with ourselves first. Do I listen when something feels misaligned? Do I honor the boundaries that I set myself? Do I follow through commitments that I make to others and to myself? Can I change directions without turning it into a judgment about who I am? And every one of these moments actually has the ability to strengthen or weaken that relationship with yourself. So why not move into strengthening it, right? And eventually, courage begins to change, because at the beginning it might sound like, oh, I'm scared, but I'm going to do it anyway. And over time, it actually becomes, I don't know exactly what will happen, but I know how to come back to myself. So for me, that's a much bigger or a much deeper form of self leadership and leadership in general, because it doesn't. It will always contain some form of uncertainty, and the goal is not to become fearless, like the warrior woman or the warrior person, and we're gonna do what we have to do no matter what. It's actually to become someone you trust. You yourself can trust yourself when fear appears or something else comes up in your life. And there is a very interesting contradiction in leadership, and we have to think that trust comes from appearing confident, right? Knowing all the answers and knowing what to say, what to do, showing very little uncertainty. But research actually shows something a little bit more nuance on this. DDI actually looked at vulnerability in leadership and found that employees were 5.3 times more likely to trust leaders who regularly demonstrate vulnerability. And when leaders generally acknowledge their failures, employees were 7.5 times more likely to trust them. So sometimes we fear behaviors and vulnerability may weaken our credibility, but it actually strengthens trust with other people. It's a one-on-one thing. But there's another statistic here. About 24% of senior leaders say they regularly allow themselves to be vulnerable. Yet only 13% of the people reporting to senior leaders said they actually see that vulnerability. And the real test comes when vulnerability is no longer theoretical. When we don't know, we don't need to make a decision. We make a mistake. And what's happening when a decision doesn't work the way you want it to work, right? It's kind of easy to talk about vulnerability when we're discussing it theoretically, but it's very different when someone asks a question and we do not know the answer. When we make a mistake, when a decision doesn't work, when we have to say, I was wrong, or I don't know yet. And that's where actually self leadership matters. If my confidence depends on always appearing right, then uncertainty becomes threatening. Feedbacks become threatening, and mistakes become threatening. And I may spend an enormous amount of energy protecting an image of competence. But if I trust myself, I can say I don't know. And I'm still capable, right? I got this wrong, but I'm still a good person. I'm still a good leader. And I can receive feedback without making it a verdict of my worth, right? So when vulnerability is grounded in self-leadership or self-awareness and responsibilities, it can actually be evidence of confidence, right? We don't need to pretend we know everything in order to trust my ability to navigate what I don't know. And for me, this understanding of self-trust becomes deeply connected to something that I've talked about throughout my work, which is calm, right? And for me, this is also where self-trust kind of connects to something deeper here. And I've talked a little bit about naturally being calm. I'm naturally a calm person, but I've learned that being calm and having access to that calm under pressure are two different things. Calm becomes less about everything around me being okay and more about knowing that I can come back to myself, right? And maybe there's another way to look about self-trust. I don't know, and I don't have to know exactly, but I can trust myself. I can trust myself. I can trust myself to move forward anyway. So when we bring all four phases together, this is the journey I see. Awareness, I see the pattern. Maybe I notice that I'm waiting for certainty, avoiding discomfort, looking for that validation, or allowing fear to make the decision. And awareness matters because we cannot consciously change what we don't recognize. Then comes courage. I'm willing to interrupt it. And this is the moment where I know what my familiar response would be, but I choose differently now. I have the conversation, I have the decision, I allow someone to disagree, right? I admit I don't know, and I set the boundary. I can even let go. And then comes something we don't talk enough, which is practice, right? One courageous decision doesn't automatically create a new way of being. We have to choose again and again. And the new response may feel uncomfortable at first. That's actually normal, right? We are asking ourselves to behave differently from what we've practiced for years 20, 30, 40 years, right? But every time we choose a new response, we create evidence. And that evidence begins building self trust, the fourth element. I start knowing myself differently, not because I've told myself to be more confident, but because I watch myself do difficult things and I watch myself recover. And I watch myself make a decision without certainty and adjust when necessary. I've watched myself stay in an uncomfortable conversation. I want to leave you with one question today. What do you already know but haven't yet had the courage to live differently? So sometimes the next level of growth is not hiding behind more information. We already know. We know the conversation we need to have. We know the decision we've been postponing. We know where we're waiting for someone else's approval. And sometimes we even know what the next step is, right? Um, and we're not missing awareness, most likely, but we're missing the courage to live what we already know. And that doesn't mean, as I said earlier, it doesn't mean making a dramatic change tomorrow, which certainly you can do, but it can be very small. It can be one honest conversation, one different response, one boundary you actually honor, right? One different decision, right? Or a decision to actually stop postponing. A moment where you notice the old pattern, and you choose not to follow it, or courage to trust yourself enough to take the next step without having the guarantee. And if this conversation resonates with you, I'd love to invite you to join the Conscious Women Circle. As I mentioned earlier, I created that community because conversation like this need more time, need more than whatever, how long I've been talking about, 45 minutes or 50 minutes. It's actually a space where we continue exploring self-leadership, and we continue exploring courage and communication and boundaries and self-trust and conscious growth. And more importantly, is actually where we allow ourselves to practice them in our real life and in leadership. And we have conversations, and we have Q&As and guided journeys and practical tools, and women who are growing alongside each other and supporting each other. And if that feels kind of like the space that you are looking for, I would love for you to join me there. And thank you for being here. Thank you for being here today, having the courage to listen, having the courage to have listen to a different perspective. And if you're watching this later on, or if something else comes up about courage that you want to kind of roll over ideas, or if you have specific questions, you're more than welcome to continue it, leaving them in the comments or DM me separately and directly. All right, guys, much blessings.